Hey everybody, it's Courtney and I'm back here with another video for Honeybee Stamps. Today I'm going to be using the Winter Anemone stamp set, which obviously is winter, but you can use it any time of the year as long as you don't use those holly leaves or the berries. So I'm going to be working on a piece of Bristol Smooth cardstock, and this is already cut to an A2 size card. I'm bringing out my mini Misty here because it is quite large as far as the images go. And I'm going to be heat embossing these images, and I'm kind of just arranging these, and honestly it did take me a little bit of time to kind of figure out how these will all fit together to pretty much cover up my entire background. You can certainly do masking if you prefer, but I just wasn't feeling that. So we have this large floral arrangement which will take up a majority of the card. So I'm going to go ahead and treat my card panel here with an anti-static tool. And then I'm going to stamp this out with VersaFine Onyx Black ink. And I did stamp it twice just to get a bold black image and to make sure that my ink stays wet a little bit longer. Now the VersaFine is a fast drying pigment ink, but it's not immediately drying. So you can still heat emboss with it, but you want to work a little bit quicker than you would with maybe Versamark. So once that was stamped out, I'm going to go ahead and sprinkle on some clear embossing powder. And I'm not going to heat set this yet. I'm going to go ahead and fill in the rest of my panel before I actually heat set it. And this will minimize the warping. Because once I heat set it, the paper is going to warp a little bit at least. And sometimes it's a little bit harder to line up in your Misty once you have that paper warped. So I'm going to kind of continue and fill in the background with some of the other images within the stamp set. Like I said, I did have to kind of play around with it a little bit to see what would fit where and without doing any masking. But like I said, you can certainly do masking. Now, I do have to apologize if the lighting is a little bit off or if the table is a little bit more wobbly than usual. I am currently working on my coffee table in my living room. I dragged out some supplies. I, believe it or not, have a wasp problem in my craft room. I'm not sure where they're coming from, and unfortunately due to this quarantine situation, there's not many people that I can call for help and that is comfortable enough to come into the home or whatever. I don't know where they're coming from. So there's not a ton of them. There's not, there's not swarms of them, but there's enough in there and they keep appearing, and enough in there where I don't want to be in there. So I dragged out as much supplies as I possibly can, and I'm kind of going back and forth a little bit, as brave as I'm trying to be brave anyway. I'm not a big bug fan, especially wasps, but I'm trying to be brave. So as you can see, I'm just kind of continuing filling in the background. I'm kind of putting in these stems as close to or touching the image that I've already stamped out so that it looks like it's coming out from behind it. And then again, just stamping that out with VersaFine. Now you may see that I'm stamping a couple of images at a time before sprinkling on that embossing powder, but I'm not letting that ink sit too long because, like I said, it is a faster drying pigment ink than sometimes we're used to. So I don't want that to start to dry before sprinkling on that embossing powder, or else obviously it won't have anything to stick to. So just going to finish up with the last couple of leaves here and then sprinkle on the rest of the embossing powder. Now I don't have my heat tool out in the living room, nor do I have a place to plug it in that would be in camera. So I did have to take the panel back to my craft room to heat set everything. And you can see that once it is heat set, we have a much bolder black outline and of course just a little bit of texture where that embossing was, and this will make the coloring a little bit easier. So I am going to be using my Zig Clean Color Real Brush pens for everything here. So I'm using a couple of different colors. I'm going to use 2 different colors on each flower and 2 different colors on each of the leaves. I'm going to start off with the lightest purple here, and I'm just going to add a little bit of color where the darkest areas would be. Now, keep in mind that the real brush pens, regardless of what brand you're using, tend to have a whole lot of pigment to them, and they stay very, very bright and vibrant, which I wanted it to be bright and vibrant, but I still wanted to get a little bit of dimension or shading. So I'm going in with the blender pen here, and I'm going to start right off where I put down that color and kind of blend that out to the rest of the petal. And you can see we certainly do get dimension. We certainly do get some shading here. However, I wanted this to be brighter and bolder, and you'll see why as far as the background goes later on. So what I ended up doing is I ended up bringing in a darker purple and just adding just a tad of that in the very darkest areas. And you can pretty much see that the darkest areas are on the base of each of the petals, so where it's coming out from the center. And I also added a little bit of shading to where the one petal would be laying behind another, or where it's kind of folded over on itself. And then I'll take that blender pen again and just extend those areas out just a little bit so that I still have that highlight. I'm going to just fill in the center of each one of these flowers solid with a yellow color. I'm not doing any blending for that. Moving on to the next color combination, this is going to be more of a light blue combination, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm not going to show you all of the coloring for this entire card because I pretty much kept to the same 3 color flowers, and obviously all of the leaves will be the same, but I did keep one of each flower or one of each color flower in here, and 2 of the leaves, just so that you can see the color combinations that I used. So you can see once I blend this light blue out, it is fairly blue, and it's even hard to see the dimension that we get or the contrast that we get. So again, I brought in a darker blue and just added a little bit more of the shading in the very darkest areas. Now, the area that the petals are folded over on themselves, this would be the lightest area of that particular petal because it would be the part that's raised up the most. So I'm not adding any color with the zig marker there. I'm just going to use my blender pen. So whatever color is left off on that blender pen, that's what I'm going to use to fill in those little folds, or those little folds, I guess you could call them, so that they would be significantly lighter than the actual petal. You'll also notice that I have a scrap piece of paper off to the left-hand side there. In between colors, I am scribbling off with that blender pen so that none of that color from before is still on there. It will, as soon as it goes clear, you're good to use it again. And sometimes when I use a darker color, I kind of do that between petals just because so much of it ends up on that blender pen. So again, going to fill in the center of this flower with that yellow color, and then I'm going to move on to the pinks. And this is where they've got really, really bright. Even though this one pink is not all that bright, and I'm not adding a whole lot of it, it's still, when I blended it out with that blender pen, I just didn't get much contrast. It stayed pretty bright and vibrant. So once I go in with the darker pink, I'm just going to add just a tiny bit of that and start blending that out. And this is where I started kind of scribbling off on that scrap piece of paper in between each one of the petals to try to get a little bit of that color off so that it wasn't too bright and vibrant. But overall, I did better on the second pink flower than I did on this one, but it is what it is. It's bright, it's vibrant, I have a little bit of contrast there, so I'm okay with that. So obviously this one doesn't have the center, so I'm not worried about the yellow here. If I was doing the center, I probably would start with the yellow first with these pinks, just because the pink tends to drag out a little bit more than the rest of the colors. Now for the leaves, I'm going to move on to a teal combination, and I'm going to do the same thing here, starting off with that lighter teal, blending that out with that blender pen, and then just adding a little bit of that darker color towards the base of the petals, or the bottom portion of the, not petals, leaves, and dragging that out a little bit. So I went ahead and colored in the rest of the flowers and the leaves with the same color combination, same way as I did for the first few, and then we are going to do the background. Now, if you've ever watched my channel before, you may have noticed that a lot of times if I'm creating a card panel, I like to mat it onto a piece of black cardstock that is just a little bit larger so that I have just a tiny bit of a black border showing. And to me, that really makes everything pop off the page. And I'm going to do the same thing in this case, only I'm going to fill in the entire background with the black marker that comes in the set of the Zig Real Brush markers. And you can notice that the one flower there in the lower right hand corner, and you may have noticed when I actually stamped it, the paper may have shifted just a tiny bit in my MISTI so that the outline was a little bit thicker than the rest of the flowers. Now, normally I wouldn't have been happy with that, but I knew I was going to fill in the entire background with the black marker so that once everything is filled in, you're really not going to notice it. So I just kept it as is. Now you'll also notice that it looks a little bit splotchy, and it will because this is a water-based marker. It's a watercolor marker. So it is going to take a little bit of time to dry, but the good thing about the zigs is that you do not need water in order to kind of set them or to blend them. You can color with them straight, which is what I'm doing here. And you can see the parts that are dry are a little bit more even. I did have a few specks of the clear embossing powder that I must not have gotten off. So some of that is kind of resisting it, but once everything is said and done and put together, you can't really notice it. I don't stress over little mistakes like that. Handmade is handmade and it's not ever supposed to be perfect. So please don't stress over tiny mistakes like that. There's no such thing as perfection when it comes to handmade. So I went ahead and tried to take a white gel pen to fill in, I think they're supposed to be little berries, but because of the embossing, the areas were way too small and it just didn't work out. So while the white gel pen was still wet, I kind of wiped that away with my finger and got rid of that completely. And then just went over that quickly with that black marker again to kind of tone down that white gel pen, and I just left it as is. There were some areas that I had to go over again just to kind of deepen the black up a little bit. But then again, I let this sit for maybe about 10 or 15 minutes just to make sure that all the ink, not just the black, but the flowers as well, were completely dry. Now, because I want this to really pop off the page, I am going to end up cutting this down just a little bit. And you can see, especially the edges are not really colored in. It kind of gives it kind of a vintagey look. And if you're going for that, then that's fine. But I'm going to cut off all four sides, just a little bit on all four sides, about 1/8 of an inch, just to get rid of those splotchy areas. And then I can adhere this down to my white card base, and I have just a little bit of the white card base showing. And again, that will really make this pop off the page even more by just having just a little bit of that white. Now for my sentiment, obviously I don't have a whole lot of room for a sentiment at this point, so I'm just going to add a very small sentiment strip using the spring stamp set, one of the smaller sentiments from the spring stamp set, and I'm going to go ahead and stamp that out with that same VersaFine Onyx Black ink onto a piece of white cardstock and then cut that down into a strip. I wasn't really sure about the placement at first, so I kind of had to play around to see where this would best fit on the card, and then I popped that up with some foam tape. And that is it. That is the card for today. Sorry guys, I know it's very simple. I'm working with limited supplies here, but as always, I will leave the supplies linked in the description box below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and have a great day. Bye.